They gave us numbers before they gave us names back. That's the part I remember most clearly, even now. Not the holding cell on Marston Station, not the smell of recycled air gone sour with 200 unwashed men, not even the view through the porthole. The moon calyx hanging out there in the dark like a bruised eye, half in shadow, Hegemony transit lanes stitched across its face in pale light. What I remember is standing in a line with 11 other condemned men, while a major named Reisman walked the row and told each of us a number, 1 through 12, calm as a man reading a grocery list. I was 7. Victor Franco, who was standing next to me, got 8. He didn't like that. Franco didn't like anything that suggested he wasn't in charge, which was probably why he was here to begin with. He turned to Reisman mid-number and said, "What happens if I don't want a number?" Reisman stopped. He was a lean man, not big, with the kind of stillness that either means a man is very patient or very dangerous. In Reisman's case, it was both. He looked at Franco for a moment without expression, the kind of look that doesn't threaten. It just observes, like a man studying a piece of machinery to understand where it's going to fail. "Then you go back to your cell," he said, "and in 31 days you go to the platform." Franco thought about that for a moment. The calculation moved behind his eyes, fast and cold. He took his number. "My name is Aldrich W. Ladek, former Staff Sergeant, 14th Expeditionary Group, United Earth Defense Force, court-martialed 18 months prior for striking a superior officer. The officer in question had ordered a retreat that left 43 men on a burning ridge to die. I hit him once with my fist and broke his jaw in 3 places. I would do it again. The tribunal didn't see it that way. They gave me a holding cell and a date on a platform, and a very small porthole to watch the war going badly from. The war had been going badly for 4 years. The Hegemony came out of the Karen Drift in force, 17 capital ships, and a support train 200 vessels long, and they hit the Proxima settlements before anyone had time to respond. What we knew about them going in was limited. They were large, roughly twice the mass of a human adult, built low and wide in the torso with a secondary musculature along the spine that served as both propulsion and a defensive structure. They were armored, a biological plating that grew over their dorsal sections like layered stone, and it stopped most infantry rounds cold. A direct hit from a standard service carbine would mark the surface and not penetrate. You had to aim for the ventral side, where the plating tapered, or for the joint articulations, which were fast-moving targets in a species that had evolved with adequate awareness of its own vulnerabilities. Most of our infantry casualties in the first 2 years came from men who had not been trained for this, who had fired where they were trained to fire, at center mass, and discovered that center mass on a Hegemony soldier was not the same proposition as center mass on anything they'd encountered before. They organized by caste, workers at the bottom, soldiers above them, and at the top a class they called the command tier, officers who directed everything, coordinated everything, whose loss sent entire units into a behavioral paralysis that took hours to reset. The worker caste and soldier caste were frightening. The command tier was what won the war. They weren't soldiers in the physical sense. Their biology had optimized them for cognition at the expense of the armoring and the muscle mass that made their lower castes so difficult to kill. They were lighter, faster, and they communicated with their soldier caste through a biological signal that our scientists spent 3 years trying to decode and never fully did. What they concluded was that the signal was constant, real-time, layered in ways that no human communication technology could replicate. The command tier didn't issue orders and wait for compliance. They adjusted continuously. They read the battlefield through thousands of sensor points, and they modeled it, and they adapted the response of every soldier under their direction in something approaching real time. They didn't fight from the front. That wasn't their way. The command tier operated from sanctuaries, fortified positions well behind any active line, deep inside whatever defensible structure the local terrain offered. Bunkers, primarily. When the Hegemony moved into a human settlement, the first thing their engineering units did was dig. They went deep and they built strong and they sealed their officers inside with multiple redundant air systems and communication relays and armored access points that our ordnance could not crack from outside. The soldier caste above could be depleted, could be fought through at enormous cost, but as long as the command tier survived and directed, the loss of soldiers was a recoverable condition. They could draw from reserves. They could adapt their approach. They always had more. We had lost 6 major engagements trying to crack those bunkers. The 6th had been a deliberate attempt with specialized penetrating munitions developed over 2 years of research. It had breached the outer shell of the target bunker and stopped there. The secondary wall had absorbed everything we sent, and the command tier inside had directed the counterattack that cost us the 9th Fleet Strike Carrier Group and 11,000 men. I was in a holding cell when that happened. I watched the reports come in through the cell block's communal screen, the numbers updating with the slow digital patience of systems that don't understand what they're tallying. Reisman waited until we all had numbers. Then he said, "You have been selected for Project Absolution. The mission is voluntary. Those who complete it will receive full pardons and reinstatement of rank. Those who decline will be returned to their cells immediately." Nobody moved. "Good," he said, "strip." I won't go into the medical processing in detail. It was thorough and it was humiliating, and by the end of it we had been weighed, measured, scanned, and cataloged like cargo. Blood typed, reflex-tested, psychological baseline recorded with the kind of instruments that give you a number for things you'd rather not have numbered. I scored in the normal range for aggression, high for spatial reasoning, moderate for pain tolerance. The technician who told me this had the manner of a man reading a weather report. Then they issued us gray fatigues and marched us to a transport bay, and flew us to a place that wasn't on any chart I ever saw, a hardened training compound on the dark side of Calyx's closest orbital neighbor, a rock with no name and barely enough gravity to keep you honest. It was there that I met the other 11 properly. Franco I've mentioned. He was wiry and dark-eyed and had the kind of smile that never touched anything above the cheekbones. Convicted of 8 counts of theft by deception and 1 count of manslaughter, the latter involving a business associate who had made the mistake of trusting him. He was sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous to hold. In the first week of training, I watched him dismantle a junior aide's authority in under 3 minutes, not through confrontation, but through the steady application of a perfectly calibrated disdain that left the aide uncertain whether he'd been insulted or complimented. Franco did it without apparent effort, the way a man does things he's been doing all his life. He was the most dangerous person in any room he was in, including rooms with people who could kill him physically, because he was always operating 2 steps ahead of the conversation everyone else thought they were having. Jefferson was a big man, quiet in the way that only genuinely strong people ever are. He'd been convicted under the civil disorder statutes, organizing resistance to conscription in his home settlement on Hector Station, where the draft had hit the lower residential levels twice as hard as the upper decks. 2 men had died in the crackdown. The tribunal decided Jefferson was responsible. Jefferson, when I asked him about it, said simply, "They needed someone to be responsible." He left it there. He had the hands of a man who had worked industrial maintenance, broad through the palm, the skin roughened in specific places by specific tools, and the bearing of a man who had spent years being the person others looked to when something needed to be decided. He was the most naturally authoritative person in our group. He was also the only one who never tried to be. Posey was young, 23 maybe, with a face that belonged on a recruitment poster. He had killed a man in a brawl over something that had started as a card game and ended in a way that couldn't be walked back. He was gentle in almost every other way, and it sat strangely on him. The violence, the way a wrong-sized coat sits strange on a man's shoulders. He laughed easily and helped with tasks that weren't his responsibility, and remembered everyone's coffee preference within the first 3 days, which in a military holding facility was the kind of detail that distinguished people who were paying attention from people who were just surviving their time. Maggot was not gentle. Maggot had been diagnosed with 4 separate psychological classifications and had killed a chaplain on his previous posting with his hands, for reasons that nobody had successfully extracted from him in 18 months of evaluation. He was thin and pale, and his eyes moved constantly, never resting, as if there were things in his peripheral vision the rest of us couldn't see. He quoted scripture with perfect recall, whole passages, not just fragments, delivered in a low, flat monotone that made the words sound like something other than comfort. He was functional in the military sense. He followed orders, maintained his equipment, ran times in training that were competitive with the group. He was also the person I was most careful never to be alone with in a confined space, and I was not alone in that calculation. Reisman knew. Reisman watched Maggot the way you watch a structural crack, not panicking, just nodding that it's there and that it has implications. The others filled in around them. There was Roscoe, big and slow-talking, convicted of a financial fraud so elaborate that the tribunal had spent 2 weeks just understanding it well enough to charge him. He had a gift for reading people and a genius for identifying what they wanted to hear, which in his civilian career had been deployed towards separating investors from their money, and which in our current situation would turn out to have more practical applications than I initially gave it credit for. Gilpin, who was a former demolitions specialist court-martialed for selling munitions out of a depot on Reach Station, a transaction he described, with perfect sincerity, as redistribution of underutilized resources. He knew explosives the way some people know music, with an intuitive understanding of the material that went past technical training into something closer to love. Sawyer, who had been a pilot before he wasn't, grounded for reasons he never explained fully, though the quality of his flying made the reason academic. Peterson, who had the particular grimness of a man who had made one mistake in a long career, and was not willing to let it define him, though it had. Bravos, who had a habit of whistling under his breath in a way that drove everyone insane, and who was the best shot in the group by a margin that was not close. Chin, compact and methodical, who took notes during every briefing in a handwriting too small to read over his shoulder. And last, Pinkley. Pinkley was mentally slow, the file said. I read that assessment and then I watched Pinkley for about a week and concluded that the assessment was wrong in a specific way. He was not slow. He processed differently. He took longer to form outputs, longer to produce the words that represented what was happening inside his head, but what was happening inside his head was substantial. He watched everything. He stored everything. He ran everything against some internal model that he never described and that I could only infer from the results. When he spoke, which wasn't often, it was always relevant. I came to trust Pinkley's assessments more than almost anyone else's, because Pinkley had no agenda and no performance and no investment in being perceived a particular way. He just reported what he saw. Reisman ran us for 6 weeks. I will say this about that period. It was the hardest physical and tactical training I had experienced in a career that included 3 years of active combat deployment. Reisman had no patience for ceremony and no use for the kind of military polish that makes formations look good and doesn't do a damn thing when the shooting starts. He wanted us functional. He wanted us capable of operating in conditions that conventional units weren't built for. He wanted us willing to improvise in ways that regular soldiers, with their training and established doctrine, were actually less suited for. The irony of this was not lost on any of us. He was taking convicted criminals and handing them situations where their criminal instincts were the asset. He was doing it deliberately and without apology. He was also willing to be creative about motivation. The first week, he took our hot water. Not all of it. Just enough that the showers ran cold and the washing facilities ran cold, and shaving in the morning became an act of genuine suffering in a facility that already had gravity set low enough that your joints ached in a background way you stopped consciously noticing after 4 days. It sounds small. After 2 days in a military facility with 12 men who were already predisposed toward resentment, toward authority of any kind, it wasn't small. It was the kind of friction that builds. Sergeant Boren, Reisman's aide, a compact man with a jaw like a blast shield and approximately zero sense of humor, who had the look of a man who had been stationed at this particular assignment, and could neither understand why nor think of any useful complaint to make about it, came through on day 3 and looked at us and said, without inflection, "You're the dirty dozen." It stuck. These things always stick when they're true. I won't pretend we became a unit easily. We didn't. Franco fought authority on principle, any authority, including mine when I was put in temporary charge of a training rotation, and he decided that my approach to a navigation exercise was suboptimal and began quietly issuing counter-instructions to the men around him. I addressed it directly, which is the only way to address Franco. Indirection gives him room, and we had a conversation that was brief and pointed and ended with a clear understanding of the order of authority. He didn't like it. He accepted it. That was all I could ask. Magot was a live wire who could turn without warning and twice had to be physically restrained by Jefferson, who was big enough to do it without it becoming a worse situation. Jefferson and Peterson had a tension between them that came from old politics. Peterson had been stationed on Hector Station during the period of Jefferson's organizing, not in the crackdown itself, but in the general apparatus, and that proximity registered as complicity in ways that took 3 weeks to address and never fully dissolved. Gilpin stole things compulsively, even in a facility where there was nothing worth stealing. Roscoe's ration supplements disappeared twice. Chin's spare bootlaces. A training manual that belonged to Boren, which led to the most uncomfortable conversation I witnessed during the 6 weeks because Boren did not have Jefferson's capacity for physical restraint and had to be talked down by Reisman from an outcome that would have eliminated our only demolition specialist. But Reisman had a talent for finding the angle. He never pushed where pushing didn't work. He pulled. He offered. He structured things so that cooperation was simply easier than not cooperating, and he did it without making the manipulation obvious, which is harder than it sounds when you're working with men who have spent their lives identifying exactly that kind of leverage. He found Franco's vanity and used it. He found Jefferson's sense of obligation and leaned on it without exploiting it, which is a distinction that matters. He found Pinkley's pride in being right and gave him situations where being right required collaboration. Slowly, unevenly, with setbacks I haven't detailed because they were painful in the small human way that doesn't make good telling, we started moving like something that might pass for a team. The war games were where I saw it first. Command had arranged a field exercise, a test of whether we were ready or whether the whole project was a waste of resources better spent on proper soldiers. We would be evaluated against Colonel Breed's regular troops, 200 of them, on a terrain simulation that covered 3 square kilometers of the rock's surface. The rules were standard military exercise rules, which meant there were rules, which meant we had already identified our advantage. Reisman briefed us on the night before and looked at us for a moment at the end, the way a man looks at something he's built and is deciding whether it's ready. "I didn't select you for your capacity to follow rules," he said. He had not told us to cheat. He had also not told us not to. That was a distinction the 11 of us understood without needing it explained. Franco had the armbands off Breed's advanced scouts within the first hour. Not through a fight, through a conversation. Specifically a conversation that positioned him as a logistics officer making a routine inspection, which he delivered with such complete authority that the scouts handed over their credentials without asking to see his. Franco was wearing them before they'd processed what had happened, moving through Breed's own lines in the right colors, feeding bad coordinates to the communication relay that Chin had already compromised from the outside. Pinkley put on a borrowed officer's coat, Franco's work again, and spent 40 minutes giving orders to Breed's left flank, redirecting them to the wrong coordinates with the calm authority of a man who had spent his life in command. He hadn't, as far as I knew, but he had watched, he had catalogued. He had assembled, from 6 weeks of observation, a perfect model of how a commanding officer moves and speaks and holds himself, and when the moment came he produced it, fully formed, from somewhere inside himself, and Breed's people followed it because people follow confident men in uniform. Breed's left flank spent 2 hours in a gully 6 kilometers from the action, awaiting an enemy incursion that was never coming. Breed was not pleased. He complained to General Worden with the particular intensity of a man who has been publicly embarrassed by people he has been publicly dismissive of. Worden watched the exercise footage, and from what Reisman told us later, laughed until he had to sit down and compose himself before he could issue his response, which was that we were cleared to proceed to mission briefing. We were not disqualified. Reisman told us the mission, in full 3 days before we dropped. There was a place. He didn't give us coordinates, just called it the Chateau, which was what the intelligence analysts had been calling it in their files, and the name had a dark humor to it that nobody commented on, because it was that kind of mission. A Hegemony command tier sanctuary, built into the rock of a HAB complex on the contested fringe of the Calyx system. Pre-war civilian structure, reinforced and expanded over 2 years of Hegemony occupation, and sealed against everything we had tried to deliver from outside. The outer wall had been hit with penetrating munitions, orbital strikes, and directed energy systems. It had absorbed all of it. The command tier inside had watched the attempts through sensors, and adjusted their defenses accordingly and gone on directing the northern front, as if we were an interesting nuisance rather than an existential threat. The engineers' estimates put the bunker at 30 meters below the main structure. It was connected to the surface by a series of environmental shafts, air intake and exhaust columns that ran from the roof of the HAB complex down through the building's core to vents in the bunker ceiling. These shafts were armored on the exterior. They were heavily armored on the exterior. Getting to them from outside was the same problem as getting to the bunker itself. Getting to them from inside the building, from above, going down, that was a different geometry. The command tier officers inside that bunker, Reisman said, spreading the schematics across the briefing table, represent the Hegemony's strategic command for the entire northern front. Intelligence puts the number at 43 individuals. Current. If the intelligence is 30 days out of date, it's 43 plus or minus 6. He paused, looked at the schematic, looked at us. If the northern front loses its command tier, he said, their soldier caste enters reset. Minimum 6 hours of paralysis, possibly 12, while subordinate command elements establish new direction. During those hours, our fleet moves. Moves to what? Jefferson asked. The supply chain through the Calyx transit lanes. 3 relay stations and a logistics hub. If we take them in a 6-hour window that the Hegemony can't respond to with coordinated force, the northern front becomes untenable for them. They pull back to the Karen Drift or they hold at a strategic disadvantage that shortens the war by years. The room was quiet, not the quiet of reluctance, the quiet of men doing arithmetic. The bunker cannot be cracked from outside, Reisman continued. We have tried, as documented. The only viable angle is from inside the HAB structure, down the environmental shafts. Gilpin's package goes in from the top, seals the shafts, and the bunker becomes what it was designed to be, a sealed environment, with one modification. The atmospheric balance the command tier requires cannot be maintained without the shafts. Without moving air, the bunker is a very expensive, very secure, very sealed room. He looked at us. 12 men, Franco said. 12. Against 43 command tier officers plus Whatever garrison they've got topside. The garrison estimates run between 60 and 90 soldiers. Franco sat back. He had the expression of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the result of. "That's sporting of them," he said, and the delivery was so dry that 3 people laughed despite themselves, including Boren, which was the only time I ever saw Boren laugh. "The shafts are our way in," Reisman continued. "Gilpin has been briefed on the incendiary package. Jefferson will anchor the ground level. The objective is not to fight through the garrison. The objective is to reach the command access panel on level 3, seal the bunker from inside, and hold the shaft entry points while Gilpin completes the package deployment. Then we get out." Magot, who had been sitting very still with his hands flat on the table, said without looking up, "We're not taking prisoners." "No," Reisman said. There was a silence in the room. Not protest. Not moral outrage. We were 12 men who had been told we were going to die on a platform in a few weeks and then had been given a different door and told to walk through it. The nature of what was on the other side of that door didn't require editorial comment. We each made our peace with it in our own way, and in that room, in that silence, the peace was made, and we went to bed. My peace, for what it's worth, was this. The Hegemony command tier had been directing the war for 4 years. 43 individuals in a bunker had authorized the burning of the Proxima settlements and the orbital siege of Hector Station, and a dozen other actions I had watched from the ground, from ridgelines, from holding cells, from the porthole of a transport. They had directed the engagement that left 43 men on a burning ridge, while my superior officer ordered a retreat that I refused to accept without expressing my opinion on it with my right hand. The command tier was not a collection of innocent bystanders to the war. They were the war's architects. As much as any architects lived in the system, we were fighting in. I slept fine that night. We dropped 4 days later. No announcement, no ceremony. Reisman came through the rack at 300, touched the frame of each bunk once as he passed, not a pat, not a shake, just a touch, an acknowledgement of presence, and said, "Get up." The insertion craft was military surplus, stripped down to nothing identifiable. No unit markings, no registration transponder that would survive a scan. Plausible deniability built into every rivet and bolt, the way certain legal instruments are constructed so that the people who benefit from them can claim they never touched them. If we were caught before we reached the target, we were criminals who had escaped a holding facility and stolen a ship. Not soldiers, not a mission. The UEDF would shake their heads and express regret, and that would be the end of it, and of us, and of the 43 men and women we had left behind in cells on Marston Station, who were not given numbers and a briefing. This was explained to us clearly and without apology. We accepted it. What did we have to apologize for that we hadn't already had documented in a tribunal? The flight in was 3 hours. We ran silent the whole way, threading through the Hegemony patrol routes in the gaps that Sawyer had spent a week memorizing from sensor logs that intelligence had risked considerable assets to acquire. He flew with his hands barely moving on the controls, the ship barely breathing, systems reduced to the minimum that kept us alive and kept us moving. He had the particular quality of concentration that good pilots develop, a stillness that is not absence but extreme presence, every processing resource directed at the problem of getting a metal cylinder through space without being detected. He put us down in a maintenance access gully on the far side of the Hab complex, so quietly that I didn't realize we'd landed until Reisman said, "Out." We had been in the air for 3 hours, and no one had spoken above a murmur. The Hab complex, called Vierlin in the old civilian charts, had housed 3,000 residents before the war. Evacuated when the Hegemony moved in the way that civilian evacuations happen, not orderly, not complete, with the losses that always accompany a population moving under pressure. The buildings were intact because the Hegemony didn't burn what it could use, and what was left of the civilian infrastructure had been adapted to their purposes with the characteristic Hegemony efficiency that was, at a distance, almost admirable. Regular patrol patterns. Maintained systems. The kind of organizational precision that spoke to a species that had been doing this, occupying, administering, directing, for longer than humans had been a spacefaring civilization. We went in through a maintenance tunnel that Reisman's intelligence source had flagged as unmonitored. It was, as far as we could tell. Franco went first, because Franco went first in every situation involving enclosed spaces and the possibility of a trap. He had a gift for it, an instinct for how spaces connected, for where the angles were, for how quickly a man could move through darkness without producing the sounds that darkness amplifies. Whatever he'd done with that gift in civilian life, in that tunnel it served us the way a scalpel serves a surgeon. We cleared the tunnel in 8 minutes and came up inside the lower maintenance level of the complex. The smell hit me first. The Hegemony had a biological odor, a compound of their waste processing and their bodies, and the particular chemistry of their atmospheric preference, something between sulfur and something I've never found the word for in 30 years of trying. You didn't forget it once you'd been near them in a confined space. It settled into your memory and stayed there. Reisman held up a fist. We froze. 2 of their soldiers were moving through the corridor 20 meters ahead. Not patrol, they were carrying something between them, a supply crate by the look of it, moving with the purposeful slouch of men doing a routine task in a location where routine tasks were all that was expected. They passed the junction and continued without varying their pace. We waited 30 seconds after the sound of them faded. Then we moved. The plan had 2 main arteries. The first was the roof. Gilpin and his 3-man team, Bravos, Chin, and Peterson, had to reach the top of the HAB structure and access the environmental shaft heads, which were visible on the schematics as 4 wide exhaust and air intake columns rising through the building like the veins of something large. Below, those shafts terminated at vents in the bunker ceiling, 40 meters of sealed column between the roof and the command tier. Gilpin's incendiary package, deployed into those columns from above, would render them non-functional. The nature of the package he'd designed, which he explained to us during briefing with the enthusiasm of a man describing a recipe he was proud of, was technically elegant in a way I'm not qualified to judge and practically effective in a way that required no qualification. The second artery was the ground floor and the external perimeter, where the garrison soldier caste had positioned their primary defensive concentrations. Jefferson, Franco, and Boren, with Sawyer as extraction driver, would hold the ground, keep the garrison from flanking Gilpin's team on the way down, keep the exterior approaches occupied enough that our exit remained viable. It was not a subtle assignment. I was with Reisman and Roscoe and Posey. My job was to get Reisman to the command access panel on level 3, a secondary control node that the building's original design had included for emergency management, and that the Hegemony engineers, working from the original schematics, had incorporated into their bunker's locking system, without fully accounting for the fact that it could be used against them. Once that panel was activated with the codes that intelligence had spent 6 months acquiring, the bunker sealed from inside. The command tier could not exit. Their communication relay, which ran through the environmental shafts, would be severed when Gilpin's package went in. 43 Hegemony strategic officers in a sealed room with no air circulation and no way to direct their soldier caste. Simple, in the way that all suicidal plans are simple before they start. We hit the first contact on level 2. I don't know if they had been tipped, or if it was a patrol rotation that Reisman's intelligence had miscalculated by minutes, or if we had been louder than we thought coming through the maintenance tunnel. 3 of their soldiers came around a junction corner, and had exactly enough time to register that they were looking at humans in an area where humans were not supposed to exist before the situation became loud and close and committed. In the narrow corridor, with their biological armor soaking up rounds that would have dropped a man, it was brutal in the way that close-quarters combat against armored opposition is always brutal, inefficient, exhausting, relying on volume and angles and the specific targeting that training drills into you until it stops being thought and becomes reflex. We got through it. We used ammunition we couldn't spare, and 2 of our people had taken hits. Posey was one of them. Left arm, a deep puncture from one of their spines. The Hegemony soldiers had secondary defensive structures along their forearms, hardened spikes that deployed under pressure with a speed that made them extremely difficult to avoid in close quarters. It wasn't fatal. It was bad enough that Posey was running on adrenaline and determination rather than full capacity, his arm strapped tight against his side, his face the controlled blank of a man who has decided not to process what he's feeling until later, if later comes. "Can you move?" Reisman asked him. "Moving," Posey said. He meant it. We moved. Above us I could hear Gilpin's team working. Not their footsteps. They were good enough to be silent in movement, but the sounds of the building changing as they progressed. A soft concussive thud that meant a sealed hatch opened by force. The hiss of pressure differential when a shaft access was breached. Distant sounds that meant progress, that meant we still had time, that meant the plan was still intact for now. Level 2 to Level 3 was a stairwell. The stairwell was guarded. Their soldiers didn't use cover the way humans do. A human in a defended position hides as much of himself as he can manage and fires around corners, and uses the geometry of the space against the threat. A Hegemony soldier in a defended position stands. Their dorsal armor absorbs direct hits that would kill a human, and they know it, and they have built their defensive doctrine around that knowledge, which is rational and effective, and which made the 2 soldiers on the stairwell into a problem that didn't have a clean solution. Reisman looked at me. I looked at Franco, who had materialized at my left elbow from somewhere behind us that I hadn't tracked his movement to. His ability to be somewhere he hadn't been was, in civilian life, a tool of the trade. Here it was something else. Franco looked at the stairwell for a moment. He looked at the floor. He said, "Give me 40 seconds and make noise." We made noise. Roscoe had a talent for it. He'd spent years running distraction in complex social frauds, and the principle transferred to physical space. He started moving in the corridor behind us, hitting panels and shouting in a direction that implied a larger group in confusion and alarm, creating the acoustic impression of an incursion from the east access corridor. The 2 soldiers on the stairwell shifted their orientation, their attention moving toward the sound, because attention always moves toward sound before it moves toward the calculation of whether the sound is what it appears to be. That shift lasted approximately 2 seconds. Franco came up through the maintenance hatch in the floor of the stairwell landing, a hatch that was listed in the original building schematics as a utility access, that the Hegemony engineers had not prioritized in their defensive planning, because it accessed a sublevel that their sensors showed as unoccupied. He was behind both soldiers before they had completed the process of reorienting from the sound in the corridor. He was precise and he was decisive, and when it was done, he was standing over 2 motionless Hegemony soldiers and looking at his wrist unit. 40 seconds, he said. 38, Reisman said. Franco almost smiled. It was the closest thing to genuine warmth I ever saw from him, that almost smile, and it lasted about a second before his face went back to the flat, calculating expression that was his default setting. Level 3. The command access panel was at the end of a service corridor that ran behind the administrative section, behind 2 doors that were not guarded because they were not, in the Hegemony's threat model, reachable. We got to within 10 meters of it before the alarm went. Not a sound, the Hegemony used light signals for internal alerts, a cascading sequence of red pulses cycling through the corridor lighting, because their species communicated partly through visual frequency, and their alarm systems reflected that preference. The effect was immediate and total. We heard their soldier caste beginning to move throughout the building, not panicked but coordinated, with the kind of rapid, organized response that spoke to their command tier still being active, still being functional, still directing from the bunker below us in real time. The 43 officers had seen something on their sensors, and they were responding. We had perhaps 90 seconds before the response arrived at our position. Now, Reisman said. We ran. The last 10 meters of that corridor were the longest of my life, not because they were far, because Franco and I were running point and a fire team of their soldiers came out of a side junction 20 meters from the panel, and there was a moment, 3 seconds, maybe 4, where the outcome of everything balanced on physics, angles, distances, reaction time. The stopping power of what we carried against what we were wearing, which was gray fatigues, and the implicit understanding that we were, as advertised, expendable. We were through it before I fully processed how we got through it. The training does that. 6 weeks of Reisman's particular methodology does that. Your body makes the decisions and your mind catches up afterward, and by then you're standing at the panel and Roscoe is behind you and Posey is covering the junction, and Reisman's hands are moving on the interface. And Roscoe was not. I heard him go down behind me. I did not look back. Looking back in that moment would have meant stopping, and stopping would have meant failing, and failing was not something I was willing to hand Roscoe as the final accounting of what his last minutes had been for. He had spent his whole career building elaborate structures in the service of his own interest, and he had spent his last minutes inside a hegemony garrison in the service of something larger than himself. And I did not see it, and I cannot tell you exactly how it went, and that gap in the record will bother me for as long as I'm alive. Reisman's hands moved through the interface with the speed of a man who had practiced this exact sequence for 3 weeks without stopping. The codes went in, the panel responded, and I felt, through the floor, through the soles of my boots, the deep mechanical sound of magnetic locks engaging in sequence throughout the level below us. The bunker ceiling. The command tier locked in their sanctuary, which was about to stop being a sanctuary. 50 meters above us, on the roof of the Hab complex, Gilpin's incendiaries went into the shafts. I didn't hear the packages deploy. I heard what came after, the change in the building's acoustic signature as 4 large environmental columns stopped moving air. A silence within the mechanical background noise that was itself a kind of sound. Gilpin had designed the packages over 3 weeks with the focused intensity of a man who has been given an interesting problem and no limitations on the solution. He had explained them to us in a briefing that ran long because he kept adding details that he found satisfying. What they did at the technical level, I understood partially. What they did at the practical level was seal 4 columns so completely that no air would move through them again without significant engineering intervention, and deliver, along the way, a package into the bunker's upper ventilation space that would ensure the command tiers' atmospheric needs were not going to be met for a very long time. The command tier needed specific atmospheric conditions. Their biology ran hot and required high-volume continuous air circulation. A sealed bunker without functioning shafts was not a sanctuary. It was a very expensive and very well-defended room with a fixed air supply and 43 individuals consuming it. The garrison above us erupted. Without command tier direction, the hegemony soldier caste didn't collapse. I want to be accurate about this because underestimating them has killed better men than me, and I won't contribute to it. They were trained. They were capable. They continued to fight. But they fought without the layered, continuous, real-time coordination that their officers provided. They fought the way any soldier fights when the command structure is suddenly absent, on training, on instinct, on individual decisions made without the benefit of the system-level awareness that their command tier's biological signal provided. The response was slower. The adjustments were coarser. The gaps in their coverage were wider. We had to get out through those gaps. Jefferson was at the ground floor. I found out what he did there afterward in pieces from the people who were present, and I have assembled it as accurately as I can. When the alarm went and the garrison began converging on the building's interior access points, Jefferson took a position at the main ground floor access corridor with a squad weapon from Gilpin's pre-positioned cache and a belt of grenades, and he held that corridor. He was one man in a space designed to be held by four, against a garrison that was trying to push through in numbers, and he held it. The weapon cycled, and he held it. The grenades went out, and he held it. He held it long enough for Gilpin's team to get off the roof and through the building and down to the extraction level, and long enough for Reisman and me and Posey, running from level 3, to make the ground floor junction and see the corridor behind Jefferson and understand what he had spent the last 11 minutes doing. Then he ran. He ran through what was left of the garrison's forward elements in the extraction corridor. He ran for the exterior with the particular quality of motion that a man has when he has been completely still for a period of time, and then is suddenly required to cover ground as quickly as his body can manage. He ran through 3 separate fire positions that the garrison had established on the exterior approach, and he was through the exterior door and into the gully, and moving toward Sawyer's ship, before any of the 3 positions had recovered enough to put accurate fire on him. I watched it from 40 meters behind him, running hard, Posey at my shoulder, Reisman ahead of us, and it is one of the few things in my life I can describe without qualification or hedging as extraordinary. Not dramatic, not cinematic, extraordinary in the literal sense of outside, the ordinary range of what human bodies and human will accomplish in combination. We reached the extraction point. Reisman counted heads. 10. We had left with 13, counting Baron. We came back with 10, and 2 of those 10 were running on wounds they hadn't stopped to treat, and one of them was Maggot, who had taken a hit at some point in the garrison fighting, and had not mentioned it to anyone and was now moving with a peculiar focused quality that was either shock or something that was always in him, and had simply come more fully to the surface. He would recover. He did recover. Whatever Maggot was, he was durable in ways that medical science found interesting, and that the rest of us found unsettling. Sawyer had the ship running when we arrived. No lights, systems minimal, the most anonymous piece of metal in the Calyx system, sitting in a maintenance gully with its pilot staring at the approach route and his hands already on the controls. We loaded in 40 seconds. The last of us in, the hatch sealed, and Sawyer was moving before the seal completed. He spent 90 minutes threading us through the Hegemony's response, because they were responding, flooding the patrol lanes with everything they could scramble, the way any organism responds when something has been done to its center. Sawyer flew without speaking. He flew with the total concentration of a man who has been stripped of everything except the one thing he does better than other men, and who is doing it as well as it can be done. Eventually, the threat indicators on his board shifted from red to amber, and he exhaled once, a single slow breath, and said, "We're through." Nobody said anything for a long time after that. The debrief happened on Marston Station 40 hours later. General Worden ran it himself, which was either a mark of the mission's significance or of his personal investment in being present for the accounting. He sat across a table from us, 9 combat effective, Reisman making 10, Boren 11, and he asked questions with the careful precision of a man who already knows most of the answers and is looking for the details that the sensor logs and intelligence summaries couldn't capture. He was thorough. He was professional. He did not express emotion at the accounting of who had not come back, which I did not hold against him. It is a specific kind of discipline, that absence, and it serves a purpose in the room where accountability happens. The Hegemony's northern front had gone silent 16 hours after we left Vireland. The coordination that had made our fleet operations predictable for 4 years, that had cost us 6 engagements and 11,000 lives in the worst single incident, that coordination stopped. The subordinate command elements that stepped in operated at a fraction of the capacity of a functioning command tier. The UEDF fleet moved in the window that silence provided and did what it had been staged to do, and the casualty reports that I read afterward were a fraction of what 6 engagements had averaged. I don't need the mathematics explained to me. I can read what the absence of 43 command mines meant to the Northern Front. Worden looked at us for a moment at the end, the particular look of a man who is measuring something and deciding how to name it. "Project Absolution is formally concluded," he said. "Your records reflect service in a classified engagement. Pardons are attached to the record of each survivor." He didn't say we were heroes. We weren't, by any definition that required cleanness. We were 12 convicted men who had been handed a door and told that the other side of it was a mission that the clean soldiers couldn't do, and we had walked through it. And we had done what we were sent to do, and 3 of us were dead. Worden left, Reisman stayed. He stood at the end of the table for a moment without speaking, without doing anything visible. Then he said, quietly, not to anyone specifically, "Dismissed." We filed out. I've been asked since, not often but enough, what it was like to serve with them, with the kind of men who end up in a military holding facility with a date on a platform. I tell people the truth, which is that the men who end up in those cells are not a different species from the men who don't. The difference is usually one thing: one order refused, one punch thrown, one line crossed, one moment where the cost of being who you are exceeded what the institution was willing to absorb. Franco was greedy and ruthless, and he could move through a dark corridor like smoke and be behind you before the thought that he might be occurred to you. Jefferson was a man who had decided that certain injustices were worth fighting at personal cost. Magot was broken in ways that made him dangerous to be near, and also in ways that made him willing to stand in a position that would have broken other men faster. Posey was gentle, and he had killed a man, and both of those things were true simultaneously, and neither canceled the other. And he ran on a punctured arm through a garrison extraction, because the mission needed him to run, and he was not going to be the reason it didn't. The Hegemony had made a mistake that their biology predisposed them to make. They organized by caste. They concentrated their irreplaceable decision-making capacity into a small group of individuals, who were then protected at enormous expense behind walls that could absorb everything we delivered at them from outside. It was rational. It was efficient. It reflected the logic of a species that had built its success on exactly that kind of hierarchical optimization. What it wasn't was resilient. Humans don't optimize that way. We spread ourselves around. We distribute our problem-solving capacity across people who are brilliant, and people who are broken, and people who were wrong once, and people who are permanently angry, and people who will stand in a corridor by themselves and hold it because the mission requires it. We put our best people in cells sometimes. It is one of our more significant institutional failures, and it will probably keep happening as long as institutions exist and people have the capacity to disappoint them. But when we reach into those cells and hand those people a problem that the clean soldiers cannot solve, something clarifying happens. The question reduces to its essential form. The mission is the mission. The door is the door. You walk through it or you don't. I was given back my rank 6 weeks after Violin. Staff Sergeant. Same as before. A new posting, new unit, the kind of assignment that comes with a file-stamped classified engagement and a set of orders that ask no questions and provide no context. The men I served with scattered into their pardons and their lives. I hear from Jefferson occasionally. He went back to Hector Station, which was not occupied by the time he returned, and he does something in the residential administration now that I suspect involves the same talent for organizing people that got him arrested. It is, one hopes, being applied with more institutional cooperation. Franco disappeared into whatever life a pardoned man with his particular skill set assembles after a war, and I have not inquired because I know enough about how those lives are assembled to understand that inquiry is not welcome. Pinkley went to signals analysis for the fleet, watching patterns, cataloging, running everything against his internal model. I heard this and thought, yes, of course, that is the job that was always his. Gilpin, I'm told, is doing something in structural engineering. The transition from destroying things to building them is, apparently, smaller than it sounds. Reisman was promoted. He didn't seem particularly pleased about it. Reisman was built for the specific weight of impossible situations, and found the ordinary weight of peacetime advancement uncomfortable in the way that certain tools are uncomfortable when applied to the wrong task. I understood that. I understand it still. The war went on for 2 more years after Violin. The Hegemony rebuilt their command-tier presence on the Northern Front over months, slowly, and with a caution they had not shown before. And that caution, that new acquired uncertainty about the inviolability of their sanctuaries, cost them initiative at moments they couldn't afford to lose it. They had learned something at Violin that their biology and their history had not prepared them to know. That there is no bunker deep enough. That 12 men with nothing left to protect, except the mission, will go where the clean armies won't. That the bottom of the barrel, when you reach it, is not empty. It is full of people who have already been through the thing that would stop the others, and who came out the other side still standing, still functional, still willing, for reasons that range from noble to mercenary to something I don't have a category for, to walk through the door. I was 7, that was my number. I still think about the 11, on the nights when the war comes back, and it comes back for men who were in it in the way that everything true comes back, not as memory exactly, but as presence, as the feeling of standing in a corridor with a count that doesn't add up to what you started with. I think about the ones we left, and the ones who made it, and the particular quality of that mission that you cannot find in a clean operation with clean soldiers and clean objectives, and someone responsible for making sure nobody gets hurt who shouldn't be hurt. We were told we were expendable. We were. That was an honest assessment of our value to the institution, and I don't argue with it. What they didn't tell us, what I don't think they knew, was that expendable is not the same as worthless. That the men who have been broken against the institution's edges still have something. That what they have, specifically, is the knowledge that the institution is not the point. The mission is the point. The men next to you are the point. The 40 million people on the northern settlements who need someone to do this are the point. The institution can afford to forget that. Expendable men cannot. I remember the moon calyx outside the porthole, hanging in the dark like something that had been damaged and decided to keep going anyway. I remember standing in a line with 11 condemned men, and being given a number, calm as a man reading a list. I was 7 and I came home, and some of us didn't, and that is all of it. That is the whole of what happened. Anything else you've heard is someone else's version. And their version didn't happen to them the same way this happened to me, and neither version is wrong, and I am done explaining it.